I want to continue my Cal Ripken daily drinking streak, but I also need to cut back on calories. So today, I'm going to show you how to make a lower calorie beer using the Party Gal method without the pesky use of a boil kettle. So let's get started. For a very informative low-gravity brewing primer, I highly recommend checking out ultralowbrewing.com. They recommend 4 different methods of production. First, there's the non-enzymatic mashing, where a mash is held at refrigerator temperatures for 8 to 24 hours. This uses about the same amount of grain as normal, but extracts mostly color, flavor, and aroma without a majority of the fermentables. Second, there is arrested or controlled fermentation, where beers are forced to stop or control fermentation via chemicals, high or low temperature, or by the yeast strain selection itself. Third, there's the boil-off method, where alcoholic beer is made as usual and the finished beer is held at a certain high temperature and the alcohol is allowed to evaporate away. And lastly, and the method I'll be using in this video, is a low grain bill and high mash temperature. Keep in mind, I'm going to be breaking some low gravity brewing rules here by using a simple base malt as well as not using a low attenuation yeast. But in my brewing world, as we say, smoke 'em if you got 'em. By turning several knobs, the goal is to make 2 distinctly different low alcohol beers from the same mash with minimal effort. You can see this by the use of capping the mash, the use of different hops and addition timing, different Kvik strains, as well as some cold side fining on the non-hazy beer. The haze brew will have additional oats and crystal added to the mash with an extra 30 minutes to rest to promote haze and add a little color. One could even choose to boil a domestic light and cold beer in order to create even more difference between the two. That said, the raw ale component adds much needed body, character, and automatically lends some haze. It's worth noting that since this is a full volume mash, that, excluding the minor gravity increase from the oats and crystal on the hazy side, the gravities will be the same for both beers, whereas in a traditional Party Gal brew, the first runnings are disproportionately strong because it's the withheld sparge water that will eventually become the small beer. The total water I need for this brew is 2 full kegs plus an additional gallon. Since I'm not using a brew pot today, I'll be leaning on my sous vide instead. I'm shooting for a 176 degree mash, so I'll heat it up to 183. While we wait on the sous vide to come up to temperature, I'll start my parboil hop tea addition on the side. As this simmers, I'll also weigh out the little grain I need for this brew and run them through the mill.
A few moments later.
The water's up to temp and the salts and acids are going in. I'm adding the grain for the mash. More or less hit the mash temperature with 174F. I'll lock up the mash tun and give it a stir at the 20-minute mark while pulling a small sample to take a hydrometer reading. Looks good at 1022. I'll strain out the hop solids from my parboiled hop tea. This will go into a sanitized keg with floating dip tube, as well as any additives such as flavoring salts and/or a hot side fining additive. Since this is a low alcohol beer, now is also a great time to pre-acidify the wort to a pH of 4.6 for the sake of food safety. Collect enough runnings to fall about an inch short of the bottom of the gas inlet in the keg, and then lock up the lid with some CO2. Now let's turn our attention to beer number 2. Here I'm adding oats and crystal to add a little something to the haze brew. Then lock it up and then wait a little bit longer.
A few moments later.
I waited a bit and pulled another sample for hydrometer reading on beer number 2. Looks like we gained a couple points from the capped mash and landed at 1024. In sanitized keg number 2, I've already got my screened floating dip tube in place and I'm adding 3 ounces of mosaic pellets. As always, don't forget to pre-acidify. The procedure is the same here. Collect runnings and set lid with CO2. I add both kegs to my water bath at the same time, so they both reach yeast pitching temperature at roughly the same time. When the wort gets down to a pitchable temperature, crack the lid, add some yeast, aerate, reset the lid with CO2, and slap on a spunding or an airlock. These are such low-gravity beers, expect but barely a queef out of the airlock or spunding valve. In fact, fermentation can happen so quickly, you might miss it entirely. These beers were held at fermentation temperature for 3 days. On the 4th day, they were put into the kegerator. On day 5, the domestic light and cold was fined with gelatin. This is what both beers look like 2 days later on day 7. An impressive visual difference by just adding a few tweaks. It's important to have realistic expectations. Will these beers fool anyone into thinking they're 7%? Absolutely not. But they could easily pass for 4%, which is pretty cool in my opinion. So revisions for next time? The Haze-Bro is so flavorful and aromatic as is, I decided not to keg hop it and drink it straight up. For the DLC, I'd be curious to try boiling it to see how it would differ from its raw ale form. Other than that, I'm extremely satisfied by the way both of these have turned out. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you very soon in the next one. Cheers. I was a little stoned. Okay, ready?